can this new Heroes of Might and Magic game succeed where Dungeons & Dragons has failed? Modiphius Entertainment has gained the rights to create a tabletop RPG set in the world of Enroth, telling the saga of Queen Catherine Ironfist and her crusade to restore Arathia. And they are promising new mechanics for the role-playing genre, but will this concept even work? There is a major shortcoming which plagues tabletop RPGs, especially those set in high fantasy settings like D&D. Of course, not every campaign runs into this, but if you play RPGs long enough, you'll eventually run up against the problem of how to manage large-scale battles, which is ironic when you consider that D&D was born out of the world of tabletop war games. In 1971, there was no such thing as Dungeons & Dragons, and the closest thing at the time was miniatures war games, one example of which was Chainmail, a game created by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin, which was meant to reenact historical battles from the medieval period on the tabletop. Chainmail not only had rules for mass combat, man-to-man combat, and jousting, but also contained a supplement for fantasy characters and magic. The fantasy supplement was originally intended to allow players to act out battle scenes from the writings of Tolkien, Anderson, Howard, and other authors. Chainmail was quite innovative at the time by introducing the concept of hero units to wargaming, which along with fantasy elements would become the base rule set for the original edition of Dungeons & Dragons in 1974. Upon initial release, D&D was marketed to wargame players and included rules for large-scale battles, and for a time, Gary Gygax would attempt to keep those epic battles as part of the RPG rule set. In 1976, a supplement for OD&D was released called Swords and Spells, which contained a system for mass combat which was more compatible with D&D than the original Chainmail rules. However, the supplement was a flop, with players just preferring to use Chainmail if large-scale battles were a part of their campaigns, and the whole concept of mass combat in D&D really didn't get much better from there. In 1985, TSR released a miniatures wargame called Battle System as a supplement for the first edition of Advanced D&D, with the idea that this would finally be the replacement for Chainmail. Battle System had two editions which were both critically acclaimed, with the first winning the H.G. Wells Award. Yeah, that guy. And even though the second edition won an award for Best Miniatures Rules of 1989, it had a similar fate to Swords and Spells, and it sold poorly in game stores. And as time went on, Dungeons & Dragons continually drifted away from its wargaming roots. Seeing this trend, Wizards of the Coast made a token effort to deal with large-scale battles in 2005 by releasing a supplemental book for D&D 3.5 called Heroes of Battle, but that book removed any pretense of having players engage in large tactical battles. The introduction straight up says, a single battle can involve hundreds, if not thousands, or tens of thousands of soldiers. That's not role-playing, that's wargaming. Instead of offering battlefield game mechanics, Heroes of Battle instead provided ideas for dealing with the battlefield as something more akin to a setting for a D&D party to adventure in. And this has been the general approach to warfare in role-playing games ever since. Mass combat mechanics have been all but forgotten in 5th edition. By and large, RPGs and wargames are now treated as distinctly separate game systems. But Modiphius Entertainment seems to want to change that, and have announced a new role-playing game set in the world of Heroes of Might and Magic 3. Now, Heroes 3 is a turn-based strategy game that came out for PC in 1999, and it really has nothing to do with role-playing, but the combat mechanics somewhat resemble those of wargames. The game is very focused on map exploration to claim resources in order to build your town and increase your army strength, all the while gaining experience for your heroes which lead the armies. These heroes function very differently than player characters in an RPG, and never actually engage in combat themselves, aside from casting magic spells to support the army they lead. Heroes of Might and Magic focuses on strategy, economy, tactics, and such, which Modiphius seems to want to incorporate into their upcoming RPG. Their webpage says that this game will be the first high fantasy setting to use their proprietary 2d20 system, where you can play as legendary heroes who call upon a nation's resources to overcome the threats arrayed against you, engage in daring assaults and desperate last stands, and lead formidable armies in a world shaped by your actions. Sounds interesting, but this usually doesn't work, as I've already pointed out. I'll talk more about this 2d20 system in a bit, but first, there are multiple problems that this game is bound to run up against. Foremost of which is the fact that wargame elements in an RPG are just too time-consuming. I've had some battles in my role-playing games that have taken hours to resolve with less than 10 units on the map. And now they want to factor in hundreds or thousands of soldiers into these encounters? Regular RPG rules don't make the cut here. The amount of work a GM would have to do is staggering, while players would wait even longer for their turn to come around. You have to bring in a whole new rule set to actually engage in mass combat, which just takes us back to the problem that Dungeons & Dragons had when they tried to reintroduce wargame elements. Role-playing games are focused on acting out a character that develops through the experience of shared storytelling, hence the term role-playing, not the heavy rule sets of wargames that are focused on strategy, tactics, and economic advantage. In fact, as time has gone on, role-players have seemed to favor simplified rules and faster combat, which was one of the key selling points of 5th edition D&D when it promised a more streamlined rule set. But that ease of play has removed the opportunity for a role player to become an effective general of a massive army. So much for a world where you can be or do anything. The standard method of handling mass combat nowadays is to have characters operate like a special ops strike force, where the mass combat is just the backdrop setting. A dungeon master just handles the greater battle as part of the narrative, where the player's actions may somehow shift the tides of battle. WotC has done playtests with mass combat on occasion, but nothing official has been released for 5e. So how does Modiphius expect to pull this off when D&D has failed for decades? Personally, I think that Archon Studio has the better idea of creating their miniatures war game set in the Heroes universe, but they're not trying to market that to role players. But I already talked about that in a previous video. Modiphius is going to have a hard time with this one. The whole dynamic of role-playing games versus war games is similar to the fate of real-time strategies when MOBAs became popular. In the late 2000s, StarCraft Brood War was the king of esports, which took hold in South Korea and spread to the rest of the world, especially when the sequel was released. But RTS carried the seeds of its own demise when Warcraft 3 custom map makers came up with Defense of the Ancients, aka Dota, the inspiration for League of Legends and Dota 2. Where StarCraft was complex, difficult to learn, and even more difficult to master, MOBAs took a more simplified approach than real-time strategies, allowing players to focus on a single hero instead of a large army. And the esports king was slowly vanquished in the late 2010s. I remember well because I was playing StarCraft 2 in the Collegiate Star League at the time. I kind of sucked actually, but that just furthers my point. Even before all this, the Warcraft RTS game suffered a similar fate when World of Warcraft was released. The fact of the matter is that war games are so complicated that new players get intimidated, and most would prefer to control a single hero than a grand army. A quick search on Google shows that there are at least 10 times as many people who play D&D than there are that play Warhammer 40k. But Modiphius still believes that they can pull this off using their 2d20 system. To their credit, in 2014, they won multiple awards including Best Role-Playing Game at the UK Games Expo with Achtung Cthulhu, which uses 2d20. Now, this is a dice pool system. Yes, just like everyone's favorite dice pool system. Magical kitties save the day. In the 2d20 system, a character has scores for attributes and disciplines. Depending on the task, a skill check is made by adding the applicable attribute and discipline scores together to come up with the target score for the task. The player then rolls 2 or more d20s from their pool of dice and counts the number of successes that they have. A roll is considered successful if a die result is lower than the target. Sounds like the love child of dice pools and THACO. Depending on the difficulty, the Game Master will require between 1 and 5 dice successes. Players also have various opportunities to gain momentum to purchase additional dice to be used when performing a task. But apparently this has led to problems in their previous games that use this system, where players are able to abuse the momentum meta currency to purchase dice whenever they need it. This ends up making the game much too easy, and the GM basically has to make each encounter as difficult as possible to create any sense of challenge in the game. Modiphius does alter the 2d20 system for each specific game, and they have quite a few of them. So the severity of the problem varies from game to game. But this brings up another point. Modiphius has been obtaining a lot of IPs to create role-playing games out of. They really have a lot of irons in the fire, and it seems to be affecting the quality of their products. I've seen multiple complaints online about problems with the layout of the rulebooks, as well as text phrasing that is confusing. And from what I've read myself, I have to say that I agree with the people complaining on Reddit. Did I just say that? Ugh, I feel so dirty. Anyway, I'm concerned that the Heroes RPG is going to have problems too, especially given how quickly this game is expected to be developed. The Kickstarter campaign is supposed to start in 2025, with delivery toward the end of that year. But I have found zero information about what this game is going to actually look like, as Modiphius has said nothing about the game on Discord except to announce their plan to make it, which makes me worry that they really haven't gotten started on this game yet. And they expect to release it in a year and a half? Wizards of the Coast and Paizo take 10 years to release new editions of D&D and Pathfinder. Paizo spent a year doing playtesting alone. I've got to call this like I see it, because it seems that Modiphius is really just acquiring as many IPs as possible in order to slap a new label on a rehashed version of their 2D20 system. And while I would love to see a Heroes of Might and Magic RPG that skillfully implements large-scale battles directly into the core game, I kind of doubt that Modiphius can pull this off. I hope that they can prove me wrong. And for anyone who hasn't heard about the Heroes 3 Miniatures wargame, I talk about it in this video.